Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations with History. This will be episode 15, and then we will be covering the Cold War from Truman to Nixon. Can you believe it's already been 15 episodes?
And I really can't.
We're coming right down to the end at this point almost.
Coming down to the end, and look where we're at.
Yeah, getting close. I'm once again joined by my astute colleague, Mr. Corey Blevins,
That's me.
and we're going to attempt to do this huge topic justice in this episode. We're mostly going to be covering political events. We're going to cover political events, some domestic, some mainly international.
Sure.
In the wake of World War II up through Vietnam. And this is going to be dominated by talk of the United States and the Soviet Union. Never fear. In our next episode, we will be going back to the beginning and we will be studying the civil rights movement, and we will go all the way back to the 1950s, and we'll cover the entire civil rights movement and kind of the fight for equality in the United States on a social level. So don't think that we're just not going to do that. That's going to be in the next episode because it's just too big. It's too
big.
Much to do in one episode.
Also, don't think those two things are unconnected.
Right.
Because they're more connected than you think they would be. But we'll talk about that later.
We will get to all of it. So first thing, a lot of information here on the post-war chaos of Europe. Churchill famously says that Europe is in chaos after the war. He says it's just a pile of rubble. He calls it a charnel house, which is where you would keep it's where you keep dead bodies.
Yes. He
says it's basically just one big blown up mausoleum.
Yeah.
Right.
Not wrong.
And he was right. I mean, France. Most of northern France destroyed. Most of Belgium, the Netherlands destroyed. All of Germany, pretty much.
Especially major cities.
Most of the major cities in Germany are destroyed. Most of Eastern Europe has been ravaged by warfare. Italy, most of the major cities destroyed.
Yeah.
So they have to figure out how they're going to reanimate, literally like Frankenstein's monster. They're going to reanimate Europe after World War II. So Churchill meets with Stalin in Moscow, and they come up with what's called the Percentages Agreement. And so basically they meet without Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they come to an informal agreement about how they're going to partition or split up the countries of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And it's very amenable to the Soviets. A lot of people think that Churchill was totally bluffing. He was never going to actually do this. And he thought that the Soviets were going to take everything they could get, and that he was actually planning to militarily occupy most of these places, like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, the Ukraine, places like that. Either way, this is the beginning of talks about how they're going to partition Europe. At the Yalta Conference, this is the last meeting of the Big Three. The Big Three being Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, and they come to an agreement that Germany and Berlin would be split into 4 Allied zones. Well, you're asking yourself, Big Three, 4 Allied zones? Why 4 Allied zones?
Well, the fourth is France.
Right.
An Allied power who had suffered greatly during the war, but because of D-Day there at the end, their liberation from Hitler's control, they had a seat at the table.
Right. And so Stalin agrees that he will partition Germany and Berlin into 4 Allied zones, but the French Allied zone has to be carved out of the American and British Allied zone, not his zone.
Yes.
Right. So even there, we're already just giving Stalin what he wants.
And it's so clear that as soon, or even right before, but especially as soon as the war is over, World War II is over, there's animosity, there's less great feelings.
Fear.
Yeah, between the Allies, especially, Britain, United States, and of course, Stalin.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear and paranoia.
Yeah.
And so later on at the Potsdam Conference, now this is actually, there are many players at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin is, of course, still there. Truman is there. Instead of Roosevelt, Harry Truman is there because Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died before victory in Europe. And so in place of Roosevelt, we have Truman. Churchill actually shows up for the beginning of the conference, but then he actually loses an election. His government loses an election, and he is replaced by Clement Attlee at the end of the conference. So by the end, the Big Three were down to the big one. Stalin is the only one left. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died, and Churchill's no longer in political power. So at Potsdam, they kind of reaffirm everything they said in Yalta, And the Soviet Union pledges that they will join the United Nations, which is supposed to be this attempt at world peace.
Right.
So by the late 1940s, the Soviet Union has installed communist governments everywhere in Eastern Europe, and this will become known as the Eastern Bloc. Basically, they would go in, they would intimidate, they would subvert popular governments, and they would install their own puppet regimes in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, places like that. And it becomes this Eastern Bloc. In 1946, George Kennan, who is a American diplomat in Moscow, sends what's called the Long Telegram. And he basically says in the Long Telegram, he says, if you think that the Soviet Union is not preparing to be on the offensive, you're wrong. Everyone here in Moscow is incredibly paranoid. They think that the Western powers are going to try to invade the Soviet Union. They're so paranoid that they are rounding up their own citizens and killing them. And he basically says that paranoia is what's running the Soviet Union, that there are spies, and then there are spies who follow the spies to make sure that they're doing the right type of spying.
That paranoia is reflective of Stalin himself, an extremely paranoid man, and as was discussed in the World War II episode, to put it lightly, not a good guy.
Right. And George Kennan actually says at a later time, he says that the Soviet Union was the closest thing to hell on earth that ever happened, right? That not just the killing. I mean, the killing was immense.
Yes.
Stalin kills hundreds of thousands of his own people.
Starting in like 1930.
Yes, starting as soon as he takes command of the Soviet Union. But really, just the paranoia and the society of the Soviet Union was just crippled by, until his death in 1953, it was absolutely crippled by this paranoid environment where you didn't know if you were going to be the next person to be picked up in a black van and driven to some place where they were going to kill you,
to be
right?
Purged.
Right, yeah. So the Long Telegram and the kind of realization by the Western powers that the Soviet Union is going to be the new geopolitical threat gives rise to the Truman Doctrine, right? And so the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan kind of go hand in hand.
Right.
That Truman says that countries that are resisting communism are going to get help from the United States.
Yep.
And the goal is to keep communism confined to where it is currently and not let it expand. And this policy of containment is going to kind of color the rest of America's experience with their Soviet enemies.
That's a good way to put it, because if you can understand containment and like kind of fix that idea in your brain or fix that goal of the United States in your brain, so much of the Cold War kind of makes more sense. If you can understand as the United States throughout much of the Cold War is doing whatever it can to keep communism from spreading, things that we'll talk about later will make a lot more sense. So kind of tuck that away.
So countries like Greece and Turkey that are on the periphery of the Soviet sphere of influence in the Eastern Bloc will get the vast majority of Marshall Plan funds in the hopes that we can rebuild their economies and get them on the good side of capitalist nations so that they won't align themselves with the Soviet Union. Now, the Marshall Plan, it rebuilds Europe. I mean, all these cities that are devastated, the Marshall Plan gives money to rebuild all these cities. Hamburg, Berlin, Saarbrücken, all these German cities that have been destroyed, they're rebuilt with American money. All of the French cities, most of them are rebuilt with American money. And it's not just that we're being nice.
Right.
It's that we understand that if we don't get these countries back on their feet, they won't give any resistance to Soviet encroachment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then famously, right after the war's over, the Soviets encircle Berlin. And in 1948, they refused to allow American and British supplies into the city. And America pulls off one of the greatest kind of end arounds in America in history, called the Berlin Airlift, where we actually just drop supplies onto the citizens of Berlin so that they can outlast basically what was an informal Russian Soviet siege of the city, trying to get the British and the Americans to give up. And we refused to give up. And this is kind of the first shot across the bow in what will become known as the Cold War. And why is it the Cold War?
The Cold War being a conflict, a tension, a time of disagreement and bickering and competition without actual warfare, without bloody fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. There will be lots of bloody fighting during the Cold War, but not like directly between the two.
We never
powers.
declare war on each other.
Correct.
Right. But we're fighting each other with proximity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Basically, it gives rise to the idea of a proxy war.
We'll give guns to other people to fight for us.
Right. And we will fight communists in other places like Korea, like Vietnam, but we won't actually be shooting at
the Soviet Union.
Right?
Yeah.
So famously, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and it kind of brings to fruition Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which you will get to interact with during this module. You know, he gives that speech in 1946, right after the war concludes in America, in Missouri, at Westminster College in Missouri. In honor, it was because it was Truman asked him to do it because Truman's from Missouri, and he thought it would be cool. And he says, you know, an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and all the ancient capitals of Eastern Europe, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Bucharest, Budapest, Sofia, they're all behind this Iron Curtain of Soviet communism, and we may never see them again.
And the Berlin Wall was very much an attempt of the Soviet Union and the East Berlin government to keep their citizens from leaving.
Right.
It's not really about keeping
people out.
It's less about keeping people out and keeping people in, because when there was no wall, if you wanted to, as an East Berliner, if you wanted to travel to West Berlin, that was not a terribly, you could do that. And then from West Berlin, perhaps travel farther on to maybe France, the United States, that kind of West Berlin lifestyle seen as a lifestyle of more personal freedom,
capitalist,
more kind of consumer goods, like capitalist lifestyle that many Eastern Berliners were leaving. And Soviet Union, of course, doesn't want that to happen. It looks really bad for communist ideas if their citizens are leaving. So they put up this huge wall, which will eventually be a very large barrier filled with barbed wire, death strips, guard towers. It's a big structure.
It gives credence to the idea of people vote with their feet.
Right.
They were voting. They didn't get to vote in the Soviet Union. There were no elections in the Soviet Union, but they were voting with their feet. They were leaving the Soviet Union and saying, I can't vote here, but this is my vote against you.
Sure.
Right. That I want to leave. So the next thing is McCarthyism. So we talked about the Red Scare in 1919, 1920.
It's coming back around.
Way back, you know. We talked about that Red Scare where Sacco and Vanzetti were famously put to death because they were considered to be communists. Now, ostensibly, they were put to death on murder charges, but it was because they were associated with communist, kind of the Communist Party in the United States. Then we see a recurrence of this Red Scare in the 1950s with McCarthyism, and Senator Joseph McCarthy is what this is named after. And, you know, what is his goal in government?
His goal, he sees himself as kind of a purger of communist sympathizers in the government. Right? He's going to famously say that they're communist sympathizers and communist spies in the State Department. Right? He'll eventually say that they're communist spies and communist sympathizers in the U.S. Army. Right? And when we talked about the Red Scare several episodes ago, we talked about how socialist or communist become this kind of label that your political enemies can kind of put on you to kind of blacklist you from American political life, discredit you. And boy, does that ever come back, because Joseph McCarthy is kind of putting this label on officials and these different people as a way to discredit them, as a way to kind of call them out, right? Expel them from kind of the political world.
And so McCarthy is a huge figure in this. Now, of course, he enjoys a little bit of success and rockets to national attention. And then he gives a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he says, I have a list of Army officials. Right. And that was kind of the nail in this coffin, because then they have the Army McCarthy hearings. And after those hearings kind of heat up and he is forced to say, you know, he doesn't actually have a list. He then falls ill and he dies there soon after.
Coming after the U.S. military, probably not a great PR move.
Right. Not a great move to attack the military. Yeah. It's like punching a baby.
Yeah. And I think an Army official famously said to him something like, have you no decency?
Right.
Sir? In the middle of the hearing, which is, people are listening to on the radio, is kind of a public event.
Right.
So it did not look good.
And so at the same time, there are people who are being brought before this, what's called the House Un-American Activities Committee, but it's called HUAC, right? The House Un-American Activity. Well, Un-American activities were things like communism, right? So this actually doesn't go away till 1975. The HUAC doesn't go away till 75, but in the early mid 50s, late 50s, and throughout the 60s, it's very common that they'll have these hearings and they'll talk about, people who might be communists or might be spies for the Soviet Union. Well, Richard Nixon really gets his start. He will later be president, but he gets his start with HUAC. HUAC is the start of his career. He is kind of not as over the top as McCarthy, but he's still got to get his bona fides by chasing those communists. Right now, here's the thing that I want to make very clear. There was a lot of wild goose chasing going on, for sure. Like the Hollywood 10, Hollywood writers who had been associated with the Communist Party, and they were blacklisted from, sent to prison, some of them, and blacklisted. They couldn't work anymore. And, famously, Ronald Reagan will be questioned about, what he knows about the Communist Party in Hollywood, and he will kind of call out some people that he sees as being communists, and of course, John Wayne is like the big anti-communist in Hollywood. And he's like used by Congress as the poster child for anti-communism in Hollywood. So there's a lot of wild goose chasing, and a lot of people probably get in trouble that really weren't a threat to the United States. But there are some people who really were threats to the United States, like the Rosenbergs, right? Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they were funneling information from the United States and information about nuclear programs from the United States to the Soviet Union. And they are caught and executed in 1953. And this kind of confirms in people's minds that there are Soviet spies. And this is part of why the Red Scare was so terrible in the United States in the 50s, because with the Rosenbergs being caught and found guilty of espionage and killed, people now start looking over their shoulder, looking at their neighbors and saying, what if they're a Soviet spy? The
label of communist could often be applied to really any kind of left-leaning political ideology. And we'll see, in the 60s, especially with like hippie movements and things like that.
The beat movement. There's a lot of, they're going to apply the label communist there. But of course, the Soviet Union had a spy network, right? They had spies in the United States and had for years, as you mentioned, a very paranoid group of folks. So they're going to have spies in the United States. Yeah, and one of the more like odd chapters in the history of HUAC is when they convict Alger Hiss of lying to Congress. So a former communist named Whittaker Chambers, who will go on to, be one of the kind of early writers for what is now National Review, which is a very right-wing publication. Right. He was a former member of the Communist Party, and he starts working with HUAC to find other communists that are still associated with the Soviet Union. He names Alger Hiss. Well, Alger Hiss is a very high-ranking government official. He's thought of very high. People think of him very highly in the United States government. So this is a very serious charge, And they go before HUAC, and there's this whole circus where Whittaker Chambers says, he's a communist. Alger Hiss says he's not a communist. He gets all these military figures to come in and defend him. Whittaker Chambers, it kind of ends with Whittaker Chambers taking members of HUAC to his farm where he produces 8mm film out of a pumpkin. Like he's hidden this film in a pumpkin.
Talk about paranoia.
Right. And it's called like the pumpkin tapes or something like that. Like it almost sounds too ridiculous to be true, but in the pumpkin tapes or whatever, they find, on this 8mm film, they develop it and they find that there are classified government documents. And these are documents that Whittaker Chambers says were in the possession of Alger Hiss, and he gave them to him when they were part of the Communist Party. So, all this goes on. Alger Hiss is eventually convicted of perjury, right? Lying to Congress. Right. And he serves, I think, 3 years in prison. But it ruins his career. Sure. I mean, he was a high-ranking government official, and now his career's over, right? So there's a lot of wild goose chasing. Some are real.
Sure.
Some of the people they find are actually spies who are trying to sell government secrets to the Soviet Union. But a lot of it is wild goose chasing. That's why McCarthyism now is synonymous with witch hunt, right? That it's the same as, burn the witch. Like, we are very scared in America now we are very attuned to and sensitive to when we feel like a government inquiry is becoming like McCarthyism, and that's probably a good thing now.
To give an illustration, when I was in high school, my high school history class, our teacher did this thing where we had recently written like a book report. We had books in the library. This was a few years ago, where online sources were not quite as available. Anyway, we wrote this book review about this book, and we had to be very careful about citing correctly. And of course, we were learning about that, and all those things. Well, he'd come in the next day, and he'd come in a very like angry way, and he's not an angry person. Immediately, we thought, oh, something's wrong. He's very angry. Slammed the door, which is a bit jolting. And he went to the front, and he kind of sat down for a minute, and all of us were sort of simmering in that anticipation, kind of afraid what was going to happen. And he held up a list, or what looked like a list. It was just like a piece of paper. And he said, I have here in my hand a list of, I want to say maybe he said like 10.
Yeah.
10 students who plagiarized on their book report.
Yeah.
Right. And this was a dual credit class that I was taking. So it made it like we were going to have to, like, this was now a college issue, right? Like, we would be accountable to the college that we were taking this class through. And it was like, he was like, you didn't cite correctly, you plagiarized, and all these things. And he starts reading the names, and you could just see as he read the names, the looks of the people who were getting called out were devastated, right?
Yeah.
And eventually called my name. And of course I was like, oh, this is it. I've been had right here. And I didn't plagiarize, but in that moment, you even start to think, well, did I really plagiarize?
Yeah.
And he did all this kind of act to demonstrate the calling out of Joseph McCarthy, right? Joseph McCarthy alleging that these things had happened when, in fact, they hadn't.
Yeah, and what happens is, what becomes so common is, the best way to ensure that you are not called a communist is to call someone else a communist, right? So when they bring these people in to testify, they say, we're not going to assume that you're a communist if you don't name anybody else, but we're basically going to just say you're a communist if you don't tell us who is a communist, because that, you're protecting them, you're protecting the communists. So it became very stylish. Just go in there and be like, well, I've got these 3 people that I know are communists. And so it became this like fear-driven, kind of ridiculous. And now, and looking back on it, we can see it was ridiculous. But at the time, it was very scary for people to think that there might be Soviet spies. So McCarthyism is a big part of this. Now, really quickly, we're going to talk about bipolar politics. Now, bipolar politics means when we have poles, right? Before World War II, we had multipolar politics, as in there were many great powers, multiple great powers.
Yes.
Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, China, Japan, like all these great powers. And great powers just means countries that have global influence, have global empires, and are able to exert global force, right? Well, after World War II, there are only 2 left. The British Empire is crumbling, right? France is in shambles. Germany is in shambles. All these other countries, Japan, shambles. China, shambles. The only 2 left are the United States and the Soviet Union. So for the first time ever, we have this bipolar system, two poles.
You can think of it almost like 2 little centers of gravity. These 2 kind of big planets who are pulling other things in the solar system around them. United States, you have kind of pulling and pushing things a certain way. The Soviet Union pulling and pushing. And it's really only those 2 big centers of gravity that are affecting things.
And so it was assumed by many political scientists that once we entered into a bipolar system, that war was inevitable, that hot war would break out and it would consume the world, right? Now, weirdly, compared to the multipolar system where we had many great powers, the bipolar system was actually much more stable, which was something that no one predicted.
The possibility of earth-destroying war caused everybody to kind of step back and say, okay, let's calm down a little bit.
The buildup, the proliferation of nuclear weapons after World War II causes people to really take into account the cost before they declared war,
Yeah.
right? Which is why we'll see a lot of war going on in non-nuclear countries like Korea and Vietnam, and a lot of squabbling in Africa, but very little to any squabbling in Europe, right, where nuclear weapons could be used. So in 1949, these Western powers, these capitalist Western powers, form what's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is built up as a political and military opponent to communism.
Yep.
Right. A little bit later, in 1955, the Soviet Union will form out of this kind of Eastern Bloc idea. They will form what's called the Warsaw Pact, and it is the major political and military opponent to NATO. So now we have this bipolar system. There are two camps, right? Now, we shouldn't overlook non-aligned countries because
Glad you said that.
You've heard people say, well, that's a third world country, right? Like they talk about maybe some country in sub-Saharan Africa, and they say that's a third world country. And we associate third world with like maybe poverty.
It's always said in the it's always said in a bit of a condescending way.
Right. But really, what does third world mean? Where did that term come from?
Third world, so like capitalist countries, like NATO countries, the United States being the big one. It's sort of the first world, right? Communist countries, Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, the big one, that's the second world. Well, the third world is a name given to, as you said, non-allied countries like Yugoslavia, India, Egypt, some others, who in their own way were trying to kind of chart this third way, middle path between the two big centers of gravity, right? Also, don't call countries third world now. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
The Cold War is over, right? There's no first, second, third.
You can say, Angola is a poor country, right? That would be correct.
But to say it's third world,
doesn't make sense because we're outside of that bipolar system now. So the really, people don't think about it, but the term third world is antiquated now.
It is. And leaders, political leaders in these third world countries during the Cold War are, again, they're not just kind of, you get the sense of just kind of sitting there. Well, not just sitting there. They have their own initiatives, own things they're attempting to do. Right.
And they are, you have the special cases of like Yugoslavia, India, and Egypt, the big ones. Yugoslavia is this Balkan nation that's made up of Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, what is now Kosovo. Those countries, it's very ethnically diverse. It's got Christians, it's got Muslims. Really, what's holding it together is its ability to withstand the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, like we won't go into it, but the strong man of Yugoslavia, Broz Tito, will famously stand up to Stalin.
Right.
Stalin's like, hey, you should install a communist government in Yugoslavia. And he's like, no. And the whole world took notice.
For sure.
When Broz Tito said no to Stalin, people were like, well, he just signed his death certificate. And they tried to kill him. There were multiple assassination attempts, but he never backed down.
Yeah.
And for a long time, even though Yugoslavia was a brutal country, a dictatorship, a brutal country with lots of social problems, it was looked up to really and held up as kind of a champion by the West in standing up to Stalin, standing up to communism. India is in a really weird place because their greatest geopolitical threat is China. And they're afraid that if they ally themselves with either the Soviet Union or the United States, that they'll just kind of be absorbed into the Asian continent. And they won't get their own self-government.
Right.
And then Egypt, in the Middle East, famously Nasser is their leader, and he plays off of both sides.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, well, the Soviet Union promised they would do this, that they'd build this infrastructure in my country. And the United States is like, no, we'll give you way more money. And, so he kind of plays them off of both sides. So we do have these non-aligned countries, but the world kind of breaks down into Western capitalism and Eastern communism. And that's really going to be the geopolitical outlook for the next, 30 years, 40 years. So the first time this kind of Cold War turns hot is in Korea. So at the end of World War II, when the Japanese when the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held territory, they were trying to take as much Japanese territory as they could before the war ended. And they basically get to like the middle of the Korean Peninsula before the war ends. They have to stop. We were actually, the United States was actually sending forces north into the Korean Peninsula to meet the Soviets,
Right.
and not to fight them, but just to say, well, I guess you'll have to stop here and not get the entire Korean Peninsula.
And that was in like 1945.
Yeah, that was in 45. So we're already like kind of jockeying for position. And so North Korea, because it was conquered by the Soviet Union, it's allied with the Soviet Union and China. And North Korea invades South Korea in 1950.
Mm-hmm.
The United States intervenes in September of 1950. And I mean, right off the bat, the United States military is just so much more advanced than the communist forces that they push them back across the border of North and South Korea. And they're just going to go ahead and push on up to the capital and basically conquer North Korea and make it into one kind of Western capitalist puppet state. But something that nobody saw coming happens, and so China invades in 1950, and just millions of men, and so the American forces are pushed back. And by this time, it's United Nations forces that there are Americans, French, Australians, British, all these people, and they're pushed back to the 38th parallel line of latitude that is now the border. Right.
One thing to mention here is how recent this is, right? And it's so clear that it's very recent with the Korean conflict. Because of course today, right, much talk is from North and South Korea. This is why, right? And this is not that long ago. North Korea and South Korea, have not existed as those separate nations that we think of them for all that long. Right. This is not long ago.
And during this conflict, Douglas MacArthur famously tries to defy the president, and because he wants to invade China. He wants to possibly use tactical nuclear weapons against China. And Truman has to take this hero, this Medal of Honor winning, hero from World War II and World War I, and fire him.
Yeah.
So the Korean War, 37,000 U.S. soldiers are killed in Korea.
Yeah.
A huge loss. If you've never been to the Korean War Memorial in D.C., it's one of the more unique memorials. It's not like a big plinth or a big like column or anything. It's just these bronze statues of U.S. servicemen kind of walking through a park, and it's very different, but it's very very moving. And so if you ever get a chance, you should go to the Korean War Memorial. The Korean War kind of ends when Eisenhower takes over the presidency. Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes president in 1953, and he very quickly ends the Korean War because public opinion, he kind of ran on ending the Korean War because public opinion was totally against it by this point.
Sure.
The next way that we're going to fight the Soviets, we were kind of fighting the Soviets in Korea, right? And most people agree, most historians agree that there were Soviet pilots who were piloting jets and bombers over Korea, and that we did actually kill some Soviets in that war, but that they covered it up. Right. That the United States and the Soviet Union covered up the fact that they had actually been fighting in the air.
The risk of the United States and Soviet Union fighting directly against each other is
catastrophic.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
So the space race, we're very quickly going to go through this. The space race was something that was very much of its time, right? It's the end of the cowboy era and the beginning of the astronaut, the spaceman era, right?
The new frontier.
The new frontier, right? Like the West was the old frontier. The cowboys, we've conquered the West. Well, the next thing is space. So in October of 1957, the USSR launched a little ball with some spikes sticking out of it into the space, right?
Straight
into the space.
In the space. It's out there now.
This scared Americans silly.
It did.
They were terrified.
Yeah. The federal government was terrified. And it actually pushes Dwight D. Eisenhower to enact the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in order to kind of shore up the American education system so that we can train more mathematicians, scientists, and engineers to combat what we saw as this Russian threat of technological advancement, that they were more technologically advanced than we were. We couldn't believe it. And if they're more technologically advanced, then that proves that communism is better.
Right.
If they can do this, then their system is outperforming ours.
Right.
And that's kind of the impetus of the space race, right? Whoever can do the most interesting feats in space, that proves that their system is the best.
Right.
Right.
It's all about, proving that your social system is better.
Yes.
And so the USSR kind of dominates early. They send the first satellite into space. They send the first animal into space. The animal, it was a dog named Laika.
Yep.
And Laika didn't make it.
Oh, that's the worst casualty
Right.
of the Cold War right there.
They the dog did die in space. They believe it died because a heat shield failed and it kind of microwaved it or whatever.
Cooked him a little bit.
Yeah. But they do send an animal into space.
Yeah.
Right. The United States in 1961 will send the first ape. So I guess we were like, well, a dog, that's a,
What is
we're going to send something that looks humanoid into
what
space.
is evolutionary closer to us?
We consulted Origin of Species and we said, dog, next step, ape.
That's what Charles Darwin said in that book.
Right.
He's like, you got to send one of these bad guys to space.
Right. So we sent an ape named Ham to space. I mean, you can't make it up.
Yeah.
And it's successful. The first man in space is a Soviet.
Yes.
His name's Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin was one of the most celebrated Soviet heroes ever.
Of course.
If you see a picture of him on the internet, he has so many medals on his chest. It's a miracle he can still stand upright.
Yeah.
They just kept stapling stuff to this guy's chest, but he was an actual hero. I mean, he fought in World War II, and then he was a test pilot, and then he goes to space. I mean, he's just, a miracle of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
We send our first man into space, Alan Shepard, in 1961.
A month later.
A month later.
So close.
We're so close, but still not getting there.
Mm-mm.
We're being beaten.
Right.
In 1962, John F. Kennedy goes to Rice University, and he gives a famous speech in which he says, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because it is easy, but because it is hard."
How were you able to say that without doing the accent?
I
I was really hoping you were going to go for that.
That was difficult.
I
But
could tell.
he says, why do we want to cure polio? Why do we want to climb mountains? Why do we want to do all these things? We don't do them because they're easy. We do them because they're hard. And actually, what gets cut out of that, I have to mention this.
Mention it.
He's giving a speech at Rice University. Rice University, famously not good at football. Right. One of the rules of college football is you never lose to food.
Good at academics.
Right. Good at academics. Good at baseball. But one of the rules of college football is you never lose to food.
Especially not Rice.
Right. And so he actually says in that string of things, why do we climb Mount Everest? Why do we cure diseases? Why does Rice play Texas? Right. We choose to do these things because not because they're easy, but because they're hard. This galvanizes the American people. And especially after the death of Kennedy, they kind of see it as his legacy going to the moon in this decade. So in 1963, the Soviets put the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. She was, in many ways, everything was equal opportunity in the Soviet Union, including imprisonment and death and all those other things.
Yes.
But in many ways, the Soviet Union did allow women to participate in roles that were usually reserved for men.
Right.
That did also include, like things that we wouldn't consider great, like being in the gulag and things like that. But Valentina Tereshkova, an amazing woman, an amazing character in Soviet history. You should give it a Google and just read her biography. It's insane.
Well, the Soviet Union does have some, how do I say this? Advantages as far as advantage is a weird word, but they get some points for perhaps civil rights type of issues. That doesn't sound right either.
No.
Well, equality of opportunity, I guess.
Right.
They get some points for that. And the reason I mention that is they're going to remind Americans of that a lot. When we get into Vietnam or really any time, the Soviet Union will address directly Black Americans.
Right.
And say, why are you all fighting for the United States who treats you like garbage? So that's an important point.
Right. And once again, they were,
that's propaganda
they were the king of optics.
Yes.
The Soviet Union, and we don't want to make any bones about this, the Soviet Union was absolutely horrendous. I mean, they killed, by some estimates, hundreds of millions.
Especially under good old Stalin.
Of their own people. Yeah. So in no way are we trying to say that they were some sort of social utopia.
No.
But they use stuff like sending a woman to space
Right.
as a way of looking at the United States and saying, look at us, look how advanced look how progressive we are
Yes.
in our ways of thinking.
You will not be able to attach the label of communist and blackmail us from this episode.
Right.
We will not have
exactly. I'm not going to be McCarthy.
I'm not going to be blacklisted. I won't be.
So finally, the United States wins the space race because we decided that the unofficial goal was to step on the moon.
Right.
Like, why that? I don't know. I guess it became the unofficial goal. But after 1969, everybody kind of just agrees that we won because we were the first ones to touch a ball in space.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin,
Mm-hmm.
Michael Collins, they go to the moon, 1969. They set foot on the moon. Neil Armstrong famously says that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mm-hmm.
Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, they make it back. Buzz Aldrin has a great career as an astronaut. He famously is like this target. It's just a weird, like, people who don't believe we landed on the moon, like conspiracy theorists who don't believe we landed on the moon. Buzz Aldrin had like a special hatred for those people. And there's a great video of him punching a guy in the face when he's like 80 years old. This is from the 2000s. He's like 80 years old, and this guy says he didn't actually land on the moon. And he just punched him in the face.
We'll talk about celebrities.
Right.
The Apollo 11 crew will become mega celebrities. They'll meet the Queen.
Right.
Queen
This is crazy.
Elizabeth II.
Neil Armstrong only ever did one commercial on television, and it was a car commercial. One commercial. That's all he did on television.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, Neil Armstrong was a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
He would go on to teach physics at, I cannot remember what college he taught physics at, but he went on to teach physics in college, and then he started some sort of engineering firm himself. But after that, they didn't try to use their fame to become rich.
Right.
They just kind of went on with their lives, true, like American heroes.
Right.
Still considered American heroes today.
They are.
And a special type of American hero because they didn't do it in like combat.
Right.
Like they weren't fighting anybody, but what they did was incredibly dangerous. Like they got on this rocket knowing that if anything went wrong, they were definitely going to die.
Yeah.
Right. So they risked their lives in the same way that a soldier might.
Right.
But they really didn't, they weren't in a war. They were in a war of sorts.
Right.
A cold war.
2 things you're going to learn from this episode. 2 things you take with you. We are not communists, and we believe the moon landing happened.
Yes, I do believe the moon landing happened.
Yes. And I'm not a communist.
I do believe the Earth is a sphere.
I do too.
See,
Can you imagine?
so much in common. So the next thing that happens, we're kind of jumping around here a little bit, but these are like the major events of the Cold War. In 1963, we have what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is under the Kennedy administration.
Mm-hmm.
Fidel Castro and his communist kind of guerrillas,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean that in terms of they were like an insurgency.
No,
like
you're telling me he did not have apes fighting for
him? He didn't have an army of guerrillas.
I thought that's who the Soviet Union sent into space. And I thought that's who we got.
So just to clarify, this is a different type of guerrilla. It's someone who is fighting a non-conventional war. They're not wearing like uniforms, and they're not associated with a government. They're trying to overthrow a government. So it's an insurgency, not an army of AK-47 wielding primates.
Yeah. Although.
So, right.
Cool idea.
If we could make it happen.
Well,
they take over Cuba in 1959.
Yes.
Cuba becomes a communist state, and it allies itself with the Soviet Union. Well, in the late 50s and early 60s, the United States had placed a lot of missiles in Turkey, which gave them a clear shot at Moscow.
Yeah.
So a lot of these intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles are placed, they're called Jupiter missiles. They're placed in Turkey with a clear shot at Moscow, right?
Yeah.
So the Soviet Union, in an attempt to kind of checkmate the United States, starts to plan to put missiles in Cuba. Mm-hmm. So you've got missiles in Turkey, we're going to put missiles in Cuba. Well, the United States, the CIA really just botches this, and they try to arm and equip these Cuban rebels who are going to try to overthrow the communist government of Cuba in what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. they basically sent them down there to their death because they were not supported by any American aircraft or any sort of American military, and they were basically mown down and killed en masse. And so, but the big thing is it's an international debacle because the United States has tried to overthrow the communist government of Cuba just out in the open. Right. And so this makes tensions even worse. And when the missiles start to show up in Cuba by ship, the United States invokes the Monroe Doctrine and they quarantine Cuba. Why did they quarantine it instead of blockading it?
When we use words like blockade
as
a military word.
To be very clear, the word that they can't use is what?
Blockade.
Blockade.
Because that's a military word, and you cannot be using a military action against the Soviet Union for obvious reasons. Everybody's going to die.
Cold War.
But if you use the word quarantine, a word we're all very familiar with.
Right.
If you use the word quarantine, then that kind of takes it away from that military context and it makes it kind of passable. Right. Even though it's the same.
Because if we blockade them, we're declaring war. Right. But if we quarantine, that's not war.
Then we're just taking our ships and circling.
So there's this very tense moment where the Soviet ships carrying these ballistic nuclear missiles are approaching this quarantine line of the United States. And there's a moment there where we're like, we might just have to nuke Russia, right?
Yeah.
And so, but we avert that crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who took over when Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev meets with Kennedy, and Kennedy tries to spin it like he was very strong and just told Khrushchev how it was going to be. You're not putting these missiles in Cuba. But really what they agreed to was the United States would remove their missiles from Turkey if the Soviet Union promised they wouldn't put missiles in Cuba. So it was really kind of a really diplomatic compromise.
Yeah. And keeping your mind again, the containment idea, right? Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. If you're the United States, your goal is to contain the spread of communist influence. And then a country 90 miles from you becomes communist, allied with the Soviet Union. It's understandable why the United States did freak out in this moment.
Yeah. So that's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many people see it as a great triumph of Kennedy's presidency, a short-lived presidency.
Yeah.
And that's what we're getting to now with national tragedy. So after the war, we had Truman, who was kind of just FDR light. Right. He promises people the fair deal, not the New Deal, but the fair deal. And he's just kind of like FDR light. I mean, that's what he was. He was FDR's fifth term.
Yeah.
And then we have Eisenhower, who is, by all accounts, a great organizer, a great figure, genuinely a good person.
Yeah.
But he's not inspiring the American people. He wins election on the back of being the hero of World War II, right? Just like Ulysses S. Grant after the Civil War, just like Zachary Taylor after the Mexican-American War.
Yeah.
He wins his laurels on the field of battle, and then he takes that home and is coaxed into running for president by the Republican Party, which he really didn't even want to do.
Yeah.
But people love him, and
he's got the Highway Act, right?
Right.
Interstate highways. As he's leaving, he's warning against the military-industrial complex. But again, because he's not such a enigmatic figure,
right? Right. In 1960, we have the election of Nixon against Kennedy, and Nixon, famously, they go on television for the first time, the first televised debate. Before that, radio had been the way that debates were held. Well, Kennedy applies makeup.
He's a looker,
and he looks. He's a good-looking guy.
Yeah, Kennedy's hot.
And he looks he looks tan, and he doesn't look like he's sweating. He just looks very calm and collected and handsome.
Yeah.
Nixon refuses makeup, and he looks like he just ran 4 miles after eating gas station sushi.
Yeah.
I mean, he is like pale as a ghost, sweating, just sweat running down his face. And what's crazy is in that debate, people who watched it on television, the vast majority said that Kennedy won.
Sure.
People who listened to it on radio, the vast majority said that Nixon won.
Yeah. And I'm not going to body shame Nixon here. Right. But even on a good day,
Nixon
is not much, Nixon, not much to look at. On a bad day, Kennedy is. All right, let's just be real about that. So that kind of brings into play the role of personal presentation into politics.
Right.
Right. Now your personal image and the way you convey yourself, to a televised audience is a big deal, because now television is more common than ever. Television is only becoming more common. So now you have that television into politics thing where candidates have to look a certain way, have to present themselves in a certain way all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You're always in the public eye.
Right.
And so Kennedy is elected, and it's called Camelot. When he's elected, he's like King Arthur, and he's bringing all these young. That was the other thing. He was the youngest president ever elected at the time.
Also Catholic.
And also a Catholic. So he's breaking down these barriers. He was the first ever Catholic president. There were a lot of reservations about whether we should elect a Catholic, which shows you how far we've come as far as religion is concerned in this country from then to now.
Is Joe Biden the second Catholic president? Has there been one before?
I believe, yes. Joe Biden's the second Catholic president. But at the time, there were people in America who were like, he's loyal to the Pope. He's going to hand over Washington, D.C. to the Pope. So a big scare there. But he comes into office and he brings this Camelot with it. There was a Broadway play called Camelot about King Arthur. And so it came out about the same time he's running for president, and people said, man, that's what it's going to be like if he wins. And he reinvigorates the government, and he's young, and he's a war hero from World War II, just like Eisenhower, but in a different way. He was young, and he was in the Navy, and he saved some guys on a ship that was sinking. Yes. And so he comes in and he just reinvigorates the country with his first inaugural address when he says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? And he just reinvigorates the American people, and he gets people feeling like we've got this rebirth of hope for the future, that, we're going to space. Our economy's back on track. All these things are going so good. He makes the Rice University speech where he says, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. After the building of the Berlin Wall, he goes to Berlin. And he gives the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. He says, I am a Berliner, right? He stands with the people of Berlin against communism. They love him for that. I mean, you need to, it might end up, I might go back and actually add it to this module. The scene when he gives this speech it's insane. It's in the Osterplatz, plaza. Yeah. And there's it's like 400,000 people.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I was just about to say, you need to watch a video of him saying these things, because not only are they very inspiring, he delivers, and I'm going to say it again, a fantastic accent throughout all these things. It's so fun to listen to him talk. This really
heavy Northeastern, Southie Boston accent.
Yeah. I'd listen.
Yeah. So he gives these amazing speeches. Yeah. He is motivational. He is inspirational to the country. Well,
which makes the next thing even worse.
Things start to go poorly for him in the Democratic Party, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Some people said that he mishandled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was having a lot of problems in the South because of his views on race and his views on reforming racist policies and possibly passing federal laws to stop Jim Crow. Right. And so he goes, famously, his running mate is Lyndon Johnson, who is a Texan, who is a racist. I mean, and that was a thing that a lot of people were back then, but Lyndon Johnson kind of openly a racist, a man of his time from the South. I mean, he was very much a man of his time. He believed, later on he will kind of change his views mainly for political reasons, but in the 1950s, he was okay with Jim Crow. Yeah. So Kennedy goes to Texas to have kind of a speaking engagement. He meets the governor of Texas at Love Field in Dallas at the airport, and they are going to drive to this engagement through the city of Dallas. And he decides to drive in an open-top car. Hindsight 2020.
Fateful decision.
I mean, fateful decision. Let's put it this way, folks. Presidents no longer ride in open-topped vehicles.
And it's because of this.
It's because of this, right? So he's riding in style down the street in Dallas, and he is shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. And we could do a whole episode on
Was he really killed by?
How many conspiracy theories can we fit into one episode?
They're all here.
They're all here. No, he was killed by Lee Harvey
Yes.
Oswald, a lone gunman in the Texas School Book Depository. Shot him multiple times. Once in the back, it went through his neck, and then once in the head, which delivered the killing blow. If he had missed on the second shot, it was a possibility Kennedy would have lived.
Yeah.
But it's just, an absolute shock to the nation.
And of course, we have video of this.
Right. There's video
Right?
of the Magruder film.
Yep.
Shows him being killed in graphic detail. I will warn you, if you go look at it, it is incredibly graphic.
It's horrific.
It is a video of a man being killed.
Just don't do it.
Just don't look at it.
Yeah.
But it's out there. It was the first time.
Yeah.
And the president was killed on film.
Yeah.
The loss of the president just shakes the nation to the core. Walter Cronkite, the most famous newsman ever, goes on television and he says, the president's been shot. And then later he comes back on television and he says the president has died. And you can see him crying.
Yeah.
He was crying. And there's a generation of people in America that were, young at this time or remember this. Mm-hmm. And they still, to this day, are emotional about the killing of John F. Kennedy, that when you bring it up, they get emotional about it.
Well, in the same way that people, any American who was alive at the time remembers where they were at on 9/11.
Right.
If you were any age where you could remember things, you probably remember where you were, right? Even I remember where I was. I was pretty young at the time.
I was in kindergarten.
Yeah, I remember kind of like the vibe.
I remember my teacher being very distraught and like tears in their eyes and like running around the building, like meeting with other people.
Yes.
I remember that from kindergarten. Yeah.
I remember talking to a neighbor about it. In the same way that we have that like core memory of that thing happening, people of this time know exactly where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot. My dad was 5 years old. It's actually his birthday. His like 5th birthday. And he can remember like seeing my granddad, like kind of, talking about upset about it. He remembers where he was. And that's this event, such a huge event for U.S. history in general, but particularly at this time.
And it kind of ends this era of, I hate to say it, but it kind of ends this era of good feelings and hope for the future.
Right.
Right. Now, after the death of Kennedy, this is when things really start to go south in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So as early as 1950, President Truman had sent Military Assistance Advisory Group, or MAG, to help the French because they were fighting these, once again, guerrillas, insurgents, communist insurgents in Vietnam, and the French were losing. This was a French colony, had been a French colony for a very long time, and it was actually a source of rubber because there's synthetic rubber that's made in the laboratory, but there's also natural rubber, which is made from trees. If you didn't know that, and it's probably coming as a shock to you, there are such things as rubber trees.
Rubber trees.
So if somebody ever mentions rubber trees, they're not joking. That's a real thing.
Yeah.
So it was a very lucrative colony because of these rubber trees. So the United States goes in to help the French. The French lose in 1954 at the siege of Dien Bien Phu.
That's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful. And the state of affairs in Vietnam is now up in the air.
Yeah.
There's no government. The United States quickly kind of sets up a puppet government in South Vietnam with a kind of a president named Diem, who is just an American puppet. He just does it whatever the American president tells him to do.
Vicious dictator. Too.
Yeah, and also very repressive.
Yeah.
Of the Buddhist population of South Vietnam, especially because he was Catholic.
He's so repressive that Buddhist monks will. I'm going to start the sentence over. He's so repressive that Buddhist monks light themselves on fire.
They immolate
in protest.
themselves. Yeah. So in 1955, Eisenhower is going to, after the fall of the French colonial government, Eisenhower sends more MAG advisors to train the South Vietnamese army, expecting the North Vietnamese to invade and try to create a communist state in Vietnam.
Yes.
And he's absolutely correct. It just takes a while.
Yeah.
The most important moment is in 1964 when the USS Maddox is hit by a torpedo in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the U.S. government claims that the torpedo came from a North Vietnamese boat and that they need to open war with North Vietnam,
Right.
but they're not going to declare war.
Right.
Congress never gives a declaration of war. They give the president plenary power over escalation of the war in what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
Yeah. One thing I want to add here is with Vietnam, it feels really complicated. But a couple things to note is the change of the role of the United States. You go from the United States sending these advisors. This is not like a lot of people. These are not like, regular soldiers on the ground. This is people there to kind of advise. Yeah. And notice how that has changed over time. Where we go from 1950, these advisors, to the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. Now we have the U.S. military in full force in Vietnam. That's one thing to pay attention to. Also, remember what the point is. Remember containment. Right? All this feels really complicated, and it is, but it's containment, right? And it's also about the domino theory, this idea that if one country in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, falls to communism, then others around it will too, and communism will spread. The whole goal of the United States is to contain the spread of communism. Again, it feels really complicated, but if you keep that kind of main thing in your head, it makes a little more sense.
Right, and Eisenhower will really be a huge proponent of domino theory, where basically he says, well, if Vietnam falls, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, India, Iran, all the way to the Middle East. And then, now you've got this huge expanse of communist countries that are tipping the balance in favor of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
So in 1964-65, we really escalate the number of troops in Vietnam. And the Battle of the Ai Drang Valley is really the first major engagement between the Viet Cong, kind of this guerrilla force that's associated with the communists, and also the North Vietnamese army in Vietnam. So it's the first open engagement, the first real open operation between the United States and North Vietnam.
Yeah.
It's been immortalized in the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and then famously in the movie with Mel Gibson, We Were Soldiers. They famously make them the 7th Cavalry. Yeah. Which, bad luck much. Like, the 7th Cavalry was famously
Custer's
Cavalry at Little Bighorn. Yeah. That's not necessarily a moniker that I would want to carry into battle. They go into the Ai Drang Valley and they begin operations against the North Vietnamese. And while the engagement is fought to a standstill, a stalemate, what they learn a few important lessons. So one of the lessons they learn is that American artillery and air power is far superior to the North Vietnamese air power and artillery. So they see that we're going to be able to get really close to the enemy and fight them in close combat while also using air support and artillery because it's so precise by this time. They also notice that for every one casualty taken by the Americans, they will inflict 12 casualties on the North Vietnamese. And this is really where we start to see this idea that we're going to win the Vietnam War by attrition or killing of soldiers. We're not going to take cities. We're not going to gain land. We're not going to take over resources. We're literally going to go out in the jungle and kill Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. And Robert McNamara is famously the kind of the brain trust behind this. He was one of the whiz kids, a economic advisor for Ford Company that brought Ford out of kind of bankruptcy and remodeled Ford in a more efficient way. And the government brings him in to do the statistical planning of the Vietnam War. And he says, look, all the statistics say all we have to do is kill this many Vietnamese soldiers and we'll win the war. And so we get this grinding war of attrition that will last really for the next decade. And by the end of it, completely turn American public opinion against the war. In 1968, we get the largest North Vietnamese offensive of the war. It's it's named the Tet Offensive because it was over the holiday of Tet in Vietnam, when most of the South Vietnamese army was at home on vacation from fighting. The United States actually stops the Tet Offensive and pushes it back into North Vietnam, but it costs many, many American lives, and it's televised, and people are seeing American, young men dying in this, harsh jungle environment, thousands and thousands of miles away from their home, and public opinion starts to turn against the war in Vietnam after the Tet Offensive. At this point, we have nearly 500,000 troops in Vietnam, 500,000 or so troops in Vietnam at the peak. And when President Johnson is voted out of office and Nixon comes into office, he starts this policy of Vietnamization, or we're going to hand over the fighting of the war to the Vietnamese, and they can fight for themselves because too many American young service members are being sacrificed in this country for what the American people see as, a Pyrrhic victory. It's not going to actually bring an end to communism. And the American public doesn't understand why so many American young men have to die in Vietnam to, quote unquote, contain communism. So starting in 1969, 70, the United States is going to start to pull out of Vietnam. And when we do that, as soon as the last members of the U.S. military are gone, the North Vietnamese sweep into South Vietnam, and Saigon falls in 1975. We get these images.
Oh, these images are unbelievable of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Mm-hmm.
The helicopters, like the last helicopter, is leaving the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. People in South Vietnam and, people who are probably connected to this government in some way are literally like clamoring to get on this helicopter, and they get left behind.
Right. And, we said it was the first televised war.
Yeah.
The first war on television. And what did that do to public opinion?
That's going to be a huge factor because now Americans are sitting down at their dinner tables, right? And at the end of the day, and they're watching images of American soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers from both sides fighting, committing some pretty rough acts, right? It's going to make the war more visceral. It's going to kind of bring the war home. And as you mentioned, that's going to galvanize a lot of opinion between wars and hawks and those who want to end the Vietnam War. They're seeing what's happening.
Hawks and doves.
Hawks and doves. What did I say?
He said wars.
Oh my gosh.
Hawks and doves. So a hawk is a war hawk, someone that wants to stay in Vietnam, and a dove is someone who wants peace.
Right.
And I have to mention this, the famous, not so famous actually, DC comic, Hawk and Dove. This was an outgrowth of this kind of 1960s movement of the Hawks and the Doves.
Yes.
And that we get two superheroes in DC Comics named Hawk and Dove, kind of showing this American dichotomy.
Right.
So in total, 58,220 American soldiers are going to be killed in the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War Memorial, the Wall of Names, is one of, just like the Korean War Memorial, it's very moving. If you ever get a chance to go to DC and see it, it is a very moving thing.
It's a haunting place.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you don't know someone whose name is up there, it's an emotional place because you see relatives, friends, people who knew those who died, like approaching the wall, looking for the name of their relative or their grandparent or their friend. That is a very sad thing to watch. It is a haunting place that should be visited.
Oh yeah. And so the Vietnam War is kind of when the American people begin to get tired of this idea of fighting communism.
Right.
That we're expending all these resources and all these lives for what? Right?
Yeah.
That's their question. For what? And so we'll see kind of a dive in public support for fighting communism, which will be reborn in the 80s with the Reagan Revolution. But for now, the 70s is kind of a very low point of public fervor for fighting communism.
Yeah.
In fact, in 1968, George McGovern tries to run for president, and he runs again in 72, and he's basically a socialist. right? George McGovern is basically a socialist candidate. And we will, of course, talk about the other candidates like George Wallace, who's a Dixiecrat in 1968. But there's a ton of political turmoil at home that is sparked by the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about in the civil rights episode that's coming up. But the Vietnam War, a turning point in the Cold War, still an open wound for many Americans.
Very recent.
Yes.
Again, this is not long ago.
Not long ago at all. So that kind of brings us to the end of this episode, and that really covers the geopolitical, international, and kind of Cold War aspects of this era.
Yeah.
Like I said, in the next episode, we will come back and we will do the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. We'll talk about the civil rights acts enacted by Lyndon Johnson. We'll talk about the Great Society, and we'll get into some of, like you alluded to earlier, some of the problems that Vietnam caused with, what will become known as guns and butter, right? How are we going to pay for the Vietnam War and pay to end poverty in America? Right. And how all these things are kind of interrelated. And I'm sure we will reference stuff that we talked about in this episode in the next episode. The next episode is not really part 2 of this, but they're definitely kind of married together in many ways.
You can't have one without the other.
Right.
Yeah.
We're coming up on the end of this journey here very, very swiftly. So
we'll be in our lifetimes
before
long on this.
In a couple episodes, I'll be talking about things that happened that I can remember.
It happened to me.
Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're better able to interact with your resources for this module, and we've enjoyed it, and we will see you soon.